truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Monday, July 8th, 2024, the 1265th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you will be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't, or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin, and you feel better about precious metals. I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company, and that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so I hope everybody had a wonderful 4th of July holiday and a nice weekend. I hope you got to see some friends or some family, have some food, think about what it means to be independent as an American. And I've been thinking about that quite a bit myself. Now, if you had a chance to watch or to listen to the Devolution Power Hour on Badlands Media from Saturday night, I talked about the Anti-Federalist Papers. I've been going through those over the last week or so. And these were the anonymously published letters and articles of those founding fathers who were opposed to the passage of the Constitution, or they simply had problems with the process, and they were expressing all of this in public, anonymously, of course, and then the Federalist Papers were in response to all of this. And so it was a conversation essentially had in public the arguments for and against the passage of this new Constitution. And this isn't generally something that we're taught about in our state schools especially, and I went to a public school for elementary school and high school. That is a state-funded and state-directed indoctrination center. And perhaps it was better back then than it is now, and perhaps it was better 25 years before that than it was for me. But we can see what the public schools are doing to children now, and we don't need to convince ourselves that that just started and it wasn't like that for us. We didn't realize it because we were children. And we often don't realize it until we understand that certain things were intentionally left out. Think about all the gaps in our understanding across a whole range of issues. And I can certainly speak for myself. I have these. We remember what we were taught. It's reinforced culturally, but it doesn't quite make sense. We just understand that big pieces are missing. And so when you go to history and you try to look at writings contemporary to whatever time you're researching, you begin to realize that you were not privy to a whole range of perspectives that not only make the situation more understandable, but in light of the new information, I find myself often switching positions, letting go of something that I supported, seeing something that I was opposed to in a whole different light. And at that point, I try to examine the dynamics from that historical period and how they match up to what we can see happening in reality right now. And I think about controlled opposition dynamics. I think about what might have explained a situation outside of that controlled opposition dynamic. I've said countless times on this show that I think the same playbook plays out in cyclical fashion over and over and over throughout time. It happens in locations all across the world. And it's not a mistake. It's an agenda. It is an agenda for control. Now, the process doesn't have to be about assigning blame, and it doesn't have to be about destroying the positive aspects of a cultural mythology. It's just helpful to understand the exploitations of the past so we can understand the exploitations happening in the present. We talk about fake news. We know we're being lied to. We know they are constructing stories about what the future will look like so that we will accept that future, and we can watch them revise the stories of the past to make the present and future make sense in any context that will support the agenda they're trying to implement. And because we can observe them doing this over time, we can understand there's no reason to believe that they just started doing it when we started noticing. History is written by the winners. They control the means of information. That means the central narrative is whatever they want it to be. And what they want it to be is that story which will convince as many people as possible to support the implementation of their agenda and the accumulation of their power. You can even be agnostic about this in a moral sense. You can even argue that everyone does this on some level, and I could accept both of those and still assert that it's valuable to understand this dynamic so that we can guide our reactions to it rather than be influenced by it. And so I've spent a lot of this year trying to get other versions of the history I was taught in school and the history as it's culturally reinforced. If, for instance, I see a culture committed to convincing me that Barack Hussein Obama is one of the greatest presidents in American history, then I have to wonder what it means if they are describing Abraham Lincoln in the exact same terms and comparing the two men. About a month ago, we discussed the series in that commie rag, The New Republic, about what they were calling the new American fascism with Donald Trump on the cover, but looking like Adolf Hitler. We talked about Brian Stelter's ridiculous dystopian fantasy about how Donald Trump was going to go after all of the real journalists. And apparently the magazine has just reached its official release date or something, because That cover in those stories just went viral again yesterday. But in both cases, we have the same people trying to convince us that Obama is Lincoln, who's the greatest person ever, and Donald Trump is Hitler, who's the worst person ever. And most of us immediately recognize that they are lying when they make the comparison. But the other thought to have is, did these same people teach us properly about these historical figures in the first place? And the answer, of course, is no. And I'm not even arguing that Abraham Lincoln wasn't good or that Hitler wasn't bad. I'm just saying that we were taught the version of these histories that most helps the regime as they implement their agenda for the accumulation of power and control. And because the positions they assert remain largely the same over time as that playbook cycles through, and the goals remain largely the same over time as that playbook cycles through, then whatever position they're asserting will have similar counter arguments every time the playbook plays through. And I want to know what those counter arguments are. I want to know what the rest of the conversation is so that I can understand how the conversation happening now will be manipulated based on every historical instance of that conversation happening. And every country I look at, any issue I look at, happening across any frame of time, the good twin, evil twin dynamic eventually comes clear. And you can discern the centralization versus decentralization tendencies. And every now and then you even get a bonus, as you do with Our Secret Constitution by George P. Fletcher, Columbia law professor and leftist, who says flat out the Civil War was waged so that Abraham Lincoln could essentially overturn the Constitution and usher in a new Constitution, our secret Constitution, that changes the United States from a republic into a democracy. It changes the purpose of the Constitution from protecting individual rights to focusing on the good of the nation. And it deprioritizes individual freedom and replaces it with equality. And Fletcher brags about it. If you understand what it is they don't want you to know, you have a pretty good idea of where the weak spots are. And I think it's important that we find those. And so we talk about the good twin, evil twin dynamic a lot because it's important to understand the factions and how factions will unite in response to incentives. And if those incentives are strong enough, they'll unite for the subjugation of the other groups who won't join them. This is a dynamic we can readily observe all across the world. From the coalition governments forming in Europe after a series of elections where the results make very little sense and are highly suggestive of massive rigging. And we can see it here as the Uniparty coalesces in an attempt to hold on to power. And so we'll come back to some of that. But as I was listening to the Anti-Federalist Papers, I happened upon Anti-Federalist number 8, which is letter number 6 from the federal farmer who is believed to be possibly a man named Melancton Smith. And I want to share a bit of that. He's talking about the people who are either advocating for or opposing the text of this new Constitution and its ratification. So this is the 6th letter from Federal Farmer. This is December 25th, 1787. And I'm skipping a few paragraphs in. He writes, "The opposers, as well as the advocates of it, confirm me in my opinion that this system affords, all circumstances considered, a better basis to build upon than the Confederation. And as to the principal defects, as the smallness of the representation, the insecurity of elections, the undue mixture of powers in the Senate, the insecurity of some essential rights, etc., the opposition appears generally to agree respecting them, and many of the ablest advocates virtually to admit them. Clear it is, the latter do not attempt manfully to defend these defective parts, but to cover them with a mysterious veil. They concede, they retract, they say we could do no better, and some of them, when a little out of temper and hard pushed, use arguments that do more honor to their ingenuity rather than to their candor and firmness. Now we have a tendency, of course, to make appeals to the founding fathers. They would have wanted this or that. This is what they intended. This is what they meant. And the question has to be which one or which ones. because we're led to believe that all of them agreed about everything. That simply isn't true. Quite clearly, there are some intense disagreements, and those disagreements mattered a great deal. And many of them still matter a great deal because some of those disagreements form the basis for some of the problems we see now. Now, again, it's not to place blame. I can't possibly know what they were dealing with. Maybe the regime had threats and they felt like this was the best they could do. But the Anti-Federalist Papers also make clear that there was no threat of war, there was no crisis or chaos, though one was being proposed by the Federalists to speed the passage of the Constitution. And when you hear something like that, you have to think, well, what does that sound like? And it sounds exactly like the playbook we often hear now. And again, good people are going to differ on things like risk tolerance or idealism versus practicality. But the point is that there were a range of positions, and not only were there a range of positions, but there were a range of factions. And he addresses that a little later on in the letter. The gentlemen who oppose the Constitution or contend for amendments in it are frequently, and with much bitterness, charged with wantonly attacking the men who framed it. The unjustness of this charge leads me to make one observation upon the conduct of parties, etc. Some of the advocates are only pretended Federalists. In fact, they wish for an abolition of the state governments. Some of them I believe to be honest Federalists, who wish to preserve substantially the state governments united under an efficient federal head. And many of them are blind tools without any object. Some of the opposers are also only pretended Federalists who want no federal government or one merely advisory. Some of them are the true Federalists. Their object, perhaps more clearly seen, is the same with that of the honest Federalists, and some of them probably have no distinct object. We might as well call the advocates and opposers Tories and Whigs, or anything else, as Federalists and Anti-Federalists. To be for or against the Constitution as it stands is not much evidence of a federal disposition. If any names are applicable to the parties on account of their general politics, they are those of Republicans and anti-Republicans. The opposers are generally men who support the rights of the body of the people and are properly Republicans. The advocates are generally men not very friendly to those rights and properly anti-Republicans. Now, I had all that in mind as I was thinking about what we've seen with the great replacement theories when it comes to Joe Biden, what we're seeing with these various elections around the world that we've been covering this year, and including the ones that have happened over the last couple of weeks that we haven't yet covered, as well as some news over the last few days about election processes in some of the so-called swing states, as well as an effort in Washington state to allow illegal aliens to vote, as well as the SAVE Act reportedly being put forward in the illegitimate Congress so that they can take attendance on who is truly America Last. I covered that actually almost 3 months ago now on April 11th in an episode called Magnificent Sifter. But I want to start with the back and forth about whether or not Joe Biden will step back and relinquish his position as fake president and fake Democratic nominee in the fake 2024 campaign. He concluded last week by sitting down for a televised interview with ABC's George Stephanopoulos, former Clinton stooge, who spent a half an hour asking Joe Biden's withering meat suit whether or not he's going to stop being fake president in 30 different ways. It's like he was negotiating on behalf of the regime with Joe Biden on television. He was essentially asking him, hey, if Jill tells you to get out, will you get out? What if Kamala and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer tell you to get out? How about then? What if Barack and Michelle come around with Gavin Newsom and his wife for tea, and at the end of that, they all suggest that you get out? Will you then get out? We spent half of the weekend hearing about cognitive tests, about how Joe Biden needs to take a cognitive test. He needs to get a doctor's note so that he can continue being fake president. Laura Loomer, quote unquote, broke news that Joe Biden's doctors had donated to Joe Biden. I have no idea why that matters. For some reason, people are now considering the principle of whether or not someone hired as White House doctor can pronounce that the duly elected leader of the free world can no longer do his job. You know, just as the founders intended. And again, I'm not saying that Joe Biden is the duly elected leader of the free world. Joe Biden's not elected and he's not leading anything. But the point is that doctors don't have the right to say a president can't be president anymore. And I don't know if you remember, but just 4 years ago, 9 out of 10 doctors told us that 2 masks would protect us better than 1 mask from the very deadliest pandemic in all of world's history. And they told us that the vaccine was very safe and very effective and it would stop transmission. Or, well, it wouldn't stop transmission, but it would stop an increase in hospitalizations. And all right, it's not going to stop transmission or an increase in hospitalizations, but it will prevent COVID deaths. And fine, it doesn't prevent COVID deaths, but it certainly doesn't cause deaths on its own. And fine, it does cause deaths on its own. But if you don't take it, you're not allowed into Dave & Buster's. Joe Biden's not in control now. He hasn't been in control for 3.5 years, which means it's no more dangerous for Joe Biden to be fake president now after the debate than it was in the 3.5 years prior to the debate. Now, I'm all good with the public narrative taking Joe Biden apart in every imaginable way, but the solution after that is not to convince people that all of the dumbest ideas are now true just because Joe Biden is such a threat. That's not waking anyone up. We don't need to pretend that getting a doctor's note is what allows the president to continue doing his job. We had actual PhDs and MDs assessing Donald Trump on television, saying he was unfit to do his job for years. We don't want to give these people more power. Joe Biden does a fine job of making himself look bad. We don't need to make ourselves look bad and sign on to a whole bunch of principles we would never actually want to represent in the future. And so today, as has happened every day since the debate, we've had a wave of stories about why Joe Biden needs to step down and step aside and relinquish control and allow Kamala to move up or allow someone else to move up. And then we have Joe Biden loudly and proudly refuting all of that, letting everyone know that he feels like $1 million and he is ready to keep on fake presidenting until the end of his days, which could be any time. But it doesn't matter. He's not going anywhere. The morning began with Biden sending a letter around to fellow Democrats. He wrote, "Now that you have returned from the 4th of July recess, I want you to know that despite all the speculation in the press and elsewhere, I'm firmly committed to staying in this race, to running this race to the end, and to beating Donald Trump. I've had extensive conversations with the leadership of the party, elected officials, rank and file members, and most importantly, Democratic voters over these past 10 days or so. I have heard the concerns that people have, their good faith fears and worries about what is at stake in this election. I'm not blind to them. Believe me, I know better than anyone the responsibility and the burden the nominee of our party carries. I carried it in 2020 when the fate of our nation was at stake. I also know these concerns from a place of real respect for my lifetime of public service and my record as president, and I've been moved by the expressions of affection from me, from so many who have known me well and supported me over the course of my public life. I've been grateful for the rock-solid, steadfast support from so many elected Democrats in Congress and all across the country, and taken great strength from the resolve and determination I've seen from so many voters and grassroots supporters, even in the hardest of weeks. I can respond to all this by saying clearly and unequivocally, I wouldn't be running again if I did not absolutely believe I was the best person to beat Donald Trump in 2024. We had a democratic nomination process, and the voters have spoken clearly and decisively. I received over 14 million votes, 87% of the votes cast across the entire nominating process. I have nearly 3,900 delegates, making me the presumptive nominee of our party by a wide margin. This was a process open to anyone who wanted to run. Only 3 people chose to challenge me. One fared so badly he left the primaries to run as an independent. Another attacked me for being too old and was soundly defeated. The voters of the Democrat Party have voted. They have chosen me to be the nominee of the party. Do we now just say this process didn't matter, that the voters don't have a say? I decline to do that. I feel a deep obligation to the faith and the trust the voters of the Democrat Party have placed in me to run this year. It was their decision to make, not the press, not the pundits, not the big donors, not any selected group of individuals, no matter how well-intentioned. The voters and the voters alone decide the nominee of the Democrat Party. How can we stand for democracy in our nation if we ignore it in our own party? I cannot do that. I will not do that. I have no doubt that I and we can and will beat Donald Trump. We have an historic record of success to run on. And then he basically lists off a series of fanciful accomplishments like fighting climate change and things Donald Trump did, like lowering the price of insulin. A full page out of the 2-page letter is just a listing of ridiculous campaign slogans. The letter concludes this way: "We are standing up for American democracy. After January 6th, Trump has proven that he is unfit to ever hold the office of president. We can never allow him anywhere near that office again, and we never will. My fellow Democrats, we have the record, the vision, and the fundamental commitment to America's freedoms and our democracy to win. The question of how to move forward has been well aired for over a week now, and it's time for it to end. We have one job, and that is to beat Donald Trump. We have 42 days to the Democrat convention and 119 days to the general election. Any weakening of resolve or lack of clarity about the task ahead only helps Trump and hurts us. It is time to come together, move forward as a unified party, and defeat Donald Trump." And so there is Joe Biden for the 10th straight day, letting everyone know he's absolutely not leaving no matter what. The Democrat governors get together. Oh, they all support Joe Biden. The Democrat senators get together. Oh, they all support Joe Biden. The Democrat House members get together. Oh, they all support Joe Biden. And then one or two or three here or there will peel off. They'll make some comments about how important it is to beat Trump. And they'll say they worry about Biden's ability to do that and whether the country will place their faith in him after what they saw at that debate. But are we supposed to pretend that they believe the elections are real? They believe that Joe Biden received 81 million real lawful American votes? Why would we pretend that? These are narrative manipulations in order to accomplish agenda-oriented goals. And the whole process, as it spirals into absurdity, becomes more and more effective at exposing what the underlying truth is. The underlying truth is that the Constitution was overthrown a long time ago. The system is not legitimate. It is rigged at every single point, and most, if not all, of the people involved are simply the spokesmen and spokeswomen of whatever powerful people, organizations, or entities put them in that position. Now, all of this can be very jarring when we've been told throughout our whole lives that this is the best governmental system ever created, and everything that happened before this was just chaos and savagery. But it wasn't just chaos and savagery. If our American ancestors, our forefathers, our founding fathers, whoever, fought the revolution and established the states, becoming independent of the British Empire and no longer colonies, well, the point was to move away from the control of that global regime. And there is no doubt that over the course of the last 250 years, the global regime has continued to increase control. It cannot then possibly be a radical thing to understand that if the goal is to remove the regime's control in all the ways they have seized it since then, if we can see that the position of president, the position we're told represents the most powerful man in the entire world, the leader of the free world, if that position can be occupied by a guy who's barely alive and unable to think in complete sentences, then that position right now is only ceremonial and things are being run by others. Should we pretend that that is the only position in our government with that arrangement? And of course it's not. The fake president called in to Morning Joe this morning to speak to Joe and Mika and read the letter I just read you. Listen to this, exact same wording.
Bottom line here is that we're not going anywhere. I am not going anywhere. I wouldn't be running if I didn't absolutely believe that I am the best candidate to beat Donald Trump in 2024. We had a Democratic nominating process where the voters spoke clearly. I won 14 million of those votes, et cetera. So I just want, I not only believe that from the beginning, but I wanted to reassert it and demonstrate that it's true. And I'm going to be doing that all through this week and from here on.
And I just want to play one more clip from this interview. Joe Biden is now going after the elites.
The American public is not going to move away from me as an average voter. And again, I'm here for two reasons, pal. One, to rebuild the economy for hardworking middle-class people, give everybody a shot. Just a straight shot. Everybody gets a fair chance, number one. Number two, remember all this talk about how I don't have the black support? Come on, give me a break. Come with me. Watch. I'm getting so frustrated by the elites. Now, I'm not talking about you guys, but about the elites in the party who they know so much more. But if any of these guys don't think I should run against me, go ahead, announce for president. Challenge me at the convention.
He just wants to give everyone a shot. And yes, he did mandate vaccines, but that cannot be what he's talking about this time. He just wants to give everyone a chance. And he gets very loud and very angry anytime it is suggested that Joe Biden doesn't own the black vote. He just made that very clear. And he made it clear that the problem is the Democrat Party elites, not Joe and Mika, of course, the other elites who think he's too old. He talked in the letter about how they already went through a very real primary, where people cast their very real votes, and they cast them en masse for Joe Biden. If people didn't want Joe Biden to run again, well, they should have primaried him. But of course, then it would have been publicized that the fake president wasn't really doing a great job, despite the media pretending for years that he was. And besides, the fall guy scenario was already set up. The plan calls for Joe Biden being taken down now, not a year ago. And although Biden says that he already beat all the challengers throughout the primaries, he's asking Democrats to go ahead and challenge him again. Let's take it to the convention. And if that happened, forget about the Olympics. Who wants to see the poll vote when you can watch Kamala Harris and Michelle Obama call Donald Trump racist in different ways? Now, could we see Kamala Harris and Michelle Obama doing their own versions of the poll vote? Maybe, but hopefully not. This is from Semaphore in the afternoon yesterday. Blitz Primary could open up Democrat race if Biden drops out. As the Democrat Party convulses over questions about President Joe Biden's mental fitness, a pair of well-connected Democrats is offering an optimistic plan that would involve the president stepping down as the nominee and the party announcing a Blitz primary process ahead of the August convention. The proposal is the work of Rosa Brooks, a Georgetown University law professor who served in the Obama and Clinton administrations and as a volunteer policy advisor to the Biden campaign in 2020, and Ted Dintersmith, a venture capitalist and education philanthropist who has donated to various Democrat campaigns. They want Biden to flip the script on the current Washington narrative of a Democrat party in chaos and for the party to see the current period as an opportunity for a reset. In the midst of malaise and crisis, we can forge an uplifting path, Dintersmith told Semaphore. Their idea goes something like this, according to a memo shared with Semaphore that has been circulated to Democrat donors and bundlers, as well as officials within the Biden campaign and administration. Now, before we get into the plan, it's worth noting that Rosa Brooks was one of the people behind the Transition Integrity Project from back in 2020. That plan for how the Uniparty would work to fortify the fraudulent election results between November 3rd, 2020 and January 20th, 2021, the date of the fake inauguration. They were ready for everything from lawfare to violence in the streets. Rosa Brooks also was the author of one of the articles in the American Fascism series in that commie rag, The New Republic, with Donald Trump's face on the cover as Hitler. So that same Rosa Brooks is behind this Blitz primary effort alongside a global philanthropist. What a pairing. Here are the steps of her plan. Biden would step down as the Democrat nominee in mid-July and announce the new system with backing from Vice President Kamala Harris. So in a week or so, potential candidates would have a few days to throw their respective hats in the ring. The Democrat Party would then begin a primary sprint in which the 6 candidates who receive the most votes from delegates pledge to run positive-only campaigns in the month leading up to the convention. So they can only say nice things about each other and about Joe Biden. It's going to be 6 Democrat candidates pushing the hate Trump messaging from what they believe would be 6 more marketable points of view, rather than just the one from Joe Biden. Instead of hearing that Donald Trump is going to tear down our democracy from an 80-year-old racist and pervert, you would get to hear it from a woman who served as fake vice president, who achieved her political status by virtue of her skin color, her sex, and a series of favors. Or you can hear the anti-Trump messaging from a black woman who used to be first lady. Or you can hear it from a California communist who uses a lot of hair gel and seems to always be on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Or you can hear it from a delusional Stepford wine mom who staged her own kidnapping with the FBI. And the list goes on, what stars they have. But wait, there's more. Back to the list. The Blitz primary would involve weekly forums with each candidate moderated by cultural icons. Michelle Obama, Oprah, and Taylor Swift are among the names floated in the memo in order to engage voters. Oh, you get it? Michelle Obama's actually one of the cultural icons, not even a candidate, at least not until the end when the TV tells us none of these candidates are up to snuff. But you know what part of the process was really attractive to Democrat voters? Whenever Michelle Obama would be having a conversation, people just really connect to her. So now that we've established Michelle Obama as a cultural icon and the most interesting person in the conversation, it would only be right if we made her one of the possible candidates. The nominee would ultimately be chosen by the delegates using ranked choice voting before the start of the Chicago convention on August 19th. So they're making it possible to rig their own Democrat nominating process. Maybe we will get shown the problems with ranked choice voting on the biggest possible national stage. And please understand that while I don't think Joe Biden is going anywhere, if he does, all good. I am totally down to watch this show. I think it might even be more interesting, to tell you the truth. Watching them use ranked choice voting on national television to rig their own already rigged Democrat primary process, all because Joe Biden's illegitimacy has made him totally unbelievable as a potential winner or any kind of leader of anything. Not the country, not the party, not any of it, is something I can get on board with. Does the country need to be taught how untenable ranked choice voting is? Yeah, maybe. The Semaphore article says it would be announced with plenty of fanfare on the 3rd day of the gathering. The memo imagines the nominee unveiled on stage with Biden, Barack Obama, and Bill Clinton. Oh, wow. Can you even just imagine the star power? How could anyone not be overwhelmed with pride? That would signal to the country that we truly have been saved. According to its authors, that being Rosa Brooks, the country would be captivated. Donations would pour in, and Biden would be celebrated as a modern-day George Washington. The proponents argue, well, he would certainly be marketed as such. And as I said before, that would only make me question George Washington. In response, a Biden campaign spokesperson pointed to comments made by the president last week about remaining in the race. I'm not letting one 90-minute debate wipe out 3.5 years of work. I'm staying in the race and I will beat Donald Trump, he said in Wisconsin. And so this is about as close to the elimination-style tournament I proposed last week as anything I could possibly imagine. Kyle Just Human said it was like having a season of The Apprentice to choose the Democrat nominee. And it really is. Maybe they think they need 6 or 7 different key anti-Trump messages going out at once to see if any of them can actually land it. Obviously, none of them will be effectively able to do that. The television will choose one and guide people into feeling like they chose it for themselves. Those decisions have already been made. They would, of course, go heavy on the fanfare and tell us all that this is a dawn of a new age of American politics or something. And it would essentially be a ridiculous clown show that would cause more and more Americans to finally end their addiction to the television as a shaper of their reality. You have to appreciate how overt they are about this stuff. In 2016, they were pretty overt when the Democrat primary was rigged against Bernie Sanders for the benefit of Hillary Clinton. And then in 2020, when it was rigged again against Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren and the rest of them in favor of Joe Biden. And of course, they need Joe Biden to go along with this so that it won't be framed as undemocratic, because they already had a very real primary and everyone already went out and voted for the very fake president Joe Biden to be a very fake president again. You can't just ignore the will of the primary voters unless the candidate himself goes along with it. And so now what we have is the beneficiary of a stolen election after a stolen primary in the fake president Joe Biden, now making the argument against Democrat election rigging. He's the one out there saying, we already had a primary process. I won it. If somebody else wanted to be the nominee, they should have challenged me in that primary process. Democrats, you know, those elites, they keep asking Joe Biden to get out and he keeps saying no. It's like when you're a kid and you're shaking up the magic 8-ball, asking it a question and you get an answer you don't like, so you shake it up again, and you get an answer you don't like, so you shake it up again. That's what we're getting throughout this process in a whole new way every time. Hey, Joe, will you step back? Don't count on it. Hey, Joe, will you resign if we finally reveal who ate your Uncle Bozy? Reply hazy, try again. Hey, Joe, will you step down if we give Jill Biden a book deal? Outlook not so good. They just keep shaking it and shaking it. Every one of these anti-Biden arguments is like another shake of the magic 8-ball. And it seems like we may soon get to the point where the Democrats and the mainstream media begin actually attempting to take Joe Biden out on the basis of everything they called a conspiracy theory for the last 5 years. Joe Biden's corruption, the kid sniffing, the fact that his daughter said he used to take inappropriate showers with her, the corrupt dealings with Russia and China and Ukraine and everywhere else, his history of racism, and the fact that he was mentored by a Klansman. Now, none of this is new to us, and the truth is it's not new to his own supporters. They just deny that it's true, at least until the television tells them. And we're reaching the point where the television might actually tell them. The point at which these ideas will be incorporated into the central narrative and the official story about Joe Biden. And if that starts happening, then all bets are off. Maybe the people around Joe Biden will start leaking out stories on Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and Kamala Harris. This sounds like a recipe for mayhem. And I get that a lot of people aren't going to like this. They're going to think that it's embarrassing. This is shameful that our country is doing this. This is a disgrace. And I agree. All of that is true. But this is what happens when the rules that people agreed to be governed by have been totally inverted, and whatever little say they have in the process has been taken from them. This is what happens when people watch the country usurped before their eyes and then comply with the new regime under the guise of protecting the institution that has already been destroyed. And speaking of the founders and Independence Day, this is from the Declaration of Independence, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right them themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Trump said in his inauguration address that his goal was to return the power to the American people. But in order to do that, the people need to be responsive as to what form that power will take and how much of the corrupt system, this train of usurpations, they are prepared to remove. Do we need such an absurd and distasteful display to the entire country to get people to understand what has happened and to give them the motivation to actually attempt to move forward? Maybe. Let them expose every level of their corruption. Let them expose their complicity and their greed and their narcissism. All of this was fully on display in 2020 in more subtle ways if people had just opened their eyes and opened their ears and opened their minds and thought about it, tried to think independently and come to their own conclusions. But that wasn't going to happen. We had the very deadly pandemic. We had the summer of love. We had the election rigging and the big lie and the very violent insurrection, and we went right into vaccine mandates, and it was just too much for everyone to handle. And we've seen how that turned out. A lot of people don't want to get the hose again. And I'm with you. I don't want to get the hose again. I would like to begin moving into whatever America's future is going to be, and I hope that the American people participate in guiding that future. But as anyone who listens to this podcast understands, I don't think that that can happen under our current election system. Now, I trust that Donald Trump and the people around him working faithfully on behalf of the American people as American patriots have a plan for no matter what happens in the future. I'm not privy to that plan. But I'm also not going to trust anyone when they say, hey, just do this easy thing and everything's going to work out okay. That's not the case. Things are way too messed up for that. And the point is that this process is not about achieving some political outcome in one election, in 1 year, so that we can all go back to normal. We can do that. We can come together and decide what must be done and then do that. But even if we were to believe that everything political would be taken care of just by Donald Trump being announced the winner of a rigged election, we have to be able to move beyond that. We have learned all of this. We have had all of these experiences for a reason, and we need to move from reacting to decisions made from the top down in a centralized way, constantly responding to authority, forming belief from authority, to a place where things are decentralized and bottom up. We think independently and decide what it is we want and pursue that. If Trump can be taken at his word, and I believe that he can be, he is handing power back to you, the American people. So what will you do with it? We should begin thinking about what that looks like. Do you want the Constitution the way it operated 50 years ago or 150 years ago or at the beginning? Or is there something different that would have prevented some of those problems? In retrospect, would the country have been better served by some of the people who opposed this or that part of the Constitution having more say in the process? One of the selling points was that the Constitution allowed for amendments, and the Anti-Federalists were told that their problems would be fixed through that amendment process. Were they fixed through the amendment process? And was the amendment process ultimately used to overturn aspects of the Constitution in favor of the global regime? And it's quite obvious that's what happened. Somebody has to think about these things, and we can't delegate that to corporate television characters. Now, I always want to make it clear that if we are able to fully expose election fraud and expose Biden's illegitimacy and some of the underlying illegitimacy of the system in the next 120 days, wonderful. And if we're able to put an election process in place in the next 120 days that allows us to have a legitimate representation of what the American people believe so that we can form a new government and keep on pushing forward, I am all for that. That's what I've been pushing for the entire time. That's the thing that has to happen. People need to come to terms with what has been done to us, what has been done to our country, what has been done in our names, assess where we're at, and figure out how to move forward. Maybe this televised reality show of the Blitz Primary would help convince the country of all of that. I know people don't want the chaos, they don't want the unseemliness, but it might be necessary to get where we need to go. It's not radical, it's not violent, it doesn't tear apart any of our constitutional institutions. It may hurt a bunch of unconstitutional ones, though. What if the solution is to have a much smaller and less powerful federal government so that more of the power rests with the states, closer to the people? What if Donald Trump already showed us that model in 2020? What if these remedies can only come from the states? And the federal government in the state it's in now, having been overthrown, having endured a long train of abuses and usurpations, needs to be reordered somehow. What if that process has already started? What if that process is already concluded? Would we even know? The television tells us that everything has been the same the whole time. Sure, everything's a little messed up, and it's hard to know what's true, and none of these people seem to be leading anything. In fact, they all seem to be incompetent and delusional and totally uninformed. But what we have to do is uphold the system as we've always believed it to be, despite it not actually being that way. I mean, consider what we might be about to see. The lessons need to be learned. Maybe this is what's required for people to learn them. And let's think a little more about what we're being shown right now. This is from Friday. NBC News. Wisconsin Supreme Court overturns ruling that barred most ballot drop boxes. And the picture in this article online right now is an older couple who looks like they're maybe in their mid-70s, fiddling with a drop box in Wisconsin, both of them wearing COVID masks. And yes, it's a picture from 2020, but that's the point. People didn't learn the lesson in 2020. They're going to learn it now. In fact, it's going to be shoved right in their faces. The Wisconsin Supreme Court on Friday ruled 4-3 to reinstate the use of most ballot drop boxes across the crucial battleground state, overturning a decision it made less than 2 years ago that banned the use of most of those boxes. Our decision today does not force or require that any municipal clerks use drop boxes, the decision Friday read. It merely acknowledges that clerks may lawfully utilize secure drop boxes in an exercise of their statutorily conferred discretion. While the ruling had largely been expected after the court's liberal justices signaled their positioning on the issue during oral arguments in the case in May, it is likely to have large ramifications on the 2024 presidential election in the crucial battleground because it effectively permits the broad use of ballot drop boxes. And that is the second time in 3 paragraphs that the phrase crucial battleground has been used to describe Wisconsin in this article by NBC News. The article repeats the slogans about COVID-19 and how they desperately needed these drop boxes in the state of emergency we experienced in 2020. And then they talk about how Republicans' claims of widespread fraud are totally baseless and unfounded, despite the fact that the Speaker of the Wisconsin Assembly, Robin Vos, admitted on camera that there was widespread fraud in the 2020 election in Wisconsin. There is overwhelming evidence of that. It is not in doubt in any way, except to people who have never checked. This is how the article says we got here. In a case brought by conservative groups, the state Supreme Court ruled in July 2022 that Wisconsin voters casting absentee ballots would no longer be able to drop them in boxes located anywhere except the offices of election clerks. It ruled that only the GOP-controlled state legislature, not the Wisconsin Elections Commission, has the power to enact laws and policy regarding absentee ballot drop boxes. After liberals won back the court majority in 2023, however, The Democrat group Priorities USA filed a suit explicitly seeking to overturn the 2022 ruling curtailing the use of drop boxes, as well as other rules and restrictions regarding absentee voting. After a Wisconsin trial court narrowed the suit, the group appealed directly to the state Supreme Court, skipping over lower appeals courts. The group had argued that the 2022 ruling was incorrectly decided due to the fact that Wisconsin law is silent on the issue of drop boxes. While the group has acknowledged that Wisconsin laws do make clear that absentee ballots must be returned by mail or in person, they raised the question in the case that it remained unclear whether voters can return absentee ballots in person to locations other than a clerk's office. So basically, the argument that returning a mail-in ballot to an unguarded drop box counts as returning the ballot in person. And so ballot drop boxes are back in Wisconsin. How did that happen? Well, the Wisconsin Supreme Court overruled its own ruling from 2 years ago after the balance on the court had shifted from conservative to liberal after an election in Wisconsin in 2023, where the campaign was tied to the issue of, you guessed it, abortion. We know there was widespread election fraud in Wisconsin in 2020. We know that the director of elections in Milwaukee County, Claire Woodall-Vaugh, was recently removed from her job. Her deputy was charged with election crimes. And yet, we have to believe there was a very legitimate ballot measure passed to defend abortion in Wisconsin and flip the balance of power in their Supreme Court, which has enabled this Dropbox ruling. So Wisconsin, crucial battleground state, swing state, and Michigan, crucial battleground state and swing state, well, they both have ballot drop boxes again. And as soon as this decision was announced on Friday, we got a poll in Bloomberg that says Joe Biden is up by 3 points in Wisconsin, and he's up in Michigan as well. And we can be depressed about this ruling and depressed about these fake news polls, but we should also understand that's a 1-2 punch saying, yes, obviously we steal elections. Here's how we do it. And look at the result. We can tell you that Joe Biden is up on Donald Trump in these two important battleground states, but we still need to remove him for his obvious weakness and ineptitude. I know some of you out there are probably worried that it's too late in the game for people to wake up to these things, but that's not true. Waking up is just that one moment. It might take forever to get to that moment, but once that moment happens, things immediately turn around and head in the opposite direction. Make these people defend their fraud system. Make them argue in favor of these ballot drop boxes. They said in 2020 they were for COVID. They're for the very deadly pandemic so that people don't have to go out too far. It made no sense then, certainly makes no sense now, but you have to make them own this. You also have to understand that voting hard against the people who run the system is probably not the way out. The Gateway Pundit last week highlighted a recent decision in Washington state that removes their residency requirement for registering to vote. They were referencing an article in the Washington outlet, thecentersquare.com from June 28th. The headline, Ferguson Hobbs agree to settlement voiding original Washington Constitution voter rule. Washington Secretary of State Steve Hobbs' office has, through agency rulemaking, officially removed a residency requirement for registering to vote enshrined in the state's original 1889 Constitution. The rulemaking occurred after both Hobbs and State Attorney General Bob Ferguson agreed to a consent decree earlier this year to settle a 2023 lawsuit arguing that the constitutional provision violated federal law due to a 2018 state law. And think about what that means for states' rights and the respect for a state's constitution. Due to a federal law made 100 years later and their own state law made 130 years later, the Democrat Secretary of State and Democrat Attorney General simply sign a consent decree and poof, the state constitution is gone. From the article, According to the consent decree, quote, as a result of this change, Washington residents who have lived at a particular address longer than 30 days do not have to meet any durational limits to vote, while new residents must meet the 30-day durational residency requirement. The consent decree stipulated that the residency requirement be removed, not just for federal elections, but for state elections as well, as long as the state does not impose a durational registration requirement to vote. If the legislature did impose that requirement before August 1st, then the 30-day residency requirement in the state constitution would be allowed to remain. If the Secretary of State's rulemaking is allowed to remain through August 1st, the legislature can impose new residency requirements in the future and reinstate the constitutional provision, but the change would not take effect until after this year's election season. Now, in the state of Washington, you can register on Election Day up until 8 p.m. and cast your vote. And so what does that mean? Well, that means they can enter new names, new ballots, and new votes into the system right up to the last minute. And because we know that we have to allow all the votes to come in, no matter how long it takes for them to arrive after the election has ended, they've now made it even easier. Whatever new registries they need to enter, they don't even need to prove that those people are residents of Washington anymore. And naturally, Washington has automatic voter registration whenever anyone signs up for their driver's license. And so, of course, all sorts of illegal aliens will be registered to vote just as they are in so many other states. Which brings us back around to the SAVE Act. I mentioned this earlier, discussed it in an episode back in April called Magnificent Sifter. You'll remember Donald Trump invited House Speaker Mike Johnson down to Mar-a-Lago, and they did a joint press conference announcing that they would be pushing this bill. And we are told it will be coming up this week in the House. Speaker Mike Johnson posted on X, formerly Twitter, on Friday, the SAVE Act will safeguard our elections by ensuring only Americans vote in federal elections. Here's what the legislation does. Requires state election officials to ask about citizenship before providing voter registration forms. Requires an individual to provide proof of citizenship in order to register to vote in federal elections. Allows state officials to accept a wide variety of documents that will make it easy for citizens to register to vote in federal elections. Provides states with access to federal agency databases so they can remove non-citizens from voter rolls and confirm citizenship for individuals lacking proof of citizenship. Directs DHS to determine whether to conduct removal proceedings if a non-citizen has been identified as having registered to vote in federal elections. And that right there is interesting. That actually sounds like it has some teeth to it. If an illegal alien thinks his chances of deportation increase if he is registered to vote, one would think it likely for that illegal alien to be more proactive in making sure he is not registered to vote, at least to the extent he has the wherewithal to understand these things and is not just being funneled and corralled and guided into all of this. And that may be giving too much benefit of the doubt in this situation. And finally, from Johnson's thread, requires DHS to notify a state chief election official whenever an individual has been naturalized to ensure our newest citizens are able to exercise their right to vote. Now, we were told over the weekend that the Democrats in the House would be bringing out their big guns to speak in opposition to this horribly racist legislation that is surely designed to silence the voices of black and brown people just because they are illegal aliens who are not supposed to have a voice in our election process whatsoever, like not at all. And now it's worth pointing out that this is a big charade. Now, can the big charade be effective in a public communications sense? Of course it can. But if we understand it's a big charade, then we should view it as a big charade. Understand the narrative manipulations, understand what the lesson of this story is, and then figure out how to properly react. We should not just pretend it's all real because there is absolutely no way that no matter what happens in the House, this is going to become law this year. It is not possible that the Republicans will pass this through the House. It will go to the Senate, where it is then passed, and then it goes to the fake president, where he signs it and it becomes a real law. There is zero chance of that happening, so instead we just observe who the opposition is and what the opposition does. Today, the Office of Management and Budget from the Executive Office of the President released a statement of administration policy in regard to the SAVE Act. The administration strongly opposes H.R. 8281, the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. It is already illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. It is a federal crime punishable by prison and fines. The alleged justification for this bill is based on easily disproven falsehoods. Additionally, making a false claim of citizenship or unlawfully voting in an election is punishable by removal from the United States and a permanent bar to admission. States already have effective safeguards in place to verify voters' eligibility and maintain the accuracy of voter rolls. This bill would do nothing to safeguard our elections, but it would make it much harder for all eligible Americans to register to vote and increase the risk that eligible voters are purged from voter rolls. The evidence is clear that the current laws to prevent non-citizen voting are working as intended. It is extraordinarily rare for non-citizens to break the law by voting in federal elections. The president has been clear. He will continue fighting to protect Americans' sacred right to vote in free, fair, and secure elections, including by calling on Congress to pass the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. If House Republicans really wanted to do something about securing our border and fixing our broken immigration system, they should vote on the border deal that the president negotiated with a bipartisan group of senators. This would provide immigration officials the resources they need to do their jobs and be the toughest and fairest set of reforms to secure the border that we have seen in decades. Now, I do want to spend some time at some point on these international elections. And if we make it through the next 24 hours without something crazy happening here in America, maybe we'll do that tomorrow. But for now, let's just think about big picture on this French election. We were told a little over a week ago that all of a sudden the far right was on the rise in Europe, and we all had to be very, very scared of this new thing that isn't Nazism right now, but definitely going to turn into it. These far-right populists just electing these far-right candidates like Marine Le Pen, who's been part of kind of the establishment for over a decade. But a week ago, we were told she won. And so we were given the front man, if you will. Marine Le Pen, obviously a woman, so front woman. But everyone rejoiced. Wow, the French have elected Marine Le Pen. It is the dawn of a new age in France. The regime has been rejected. Look at how good these elections are. They are totally legitimate and always produce a proper winner. And then what happened? Well, that rug got immediately pulled out from under everyone who decided to step on it. People celebrated the victory of the front man, and in doing so attested to the legitimacy of the election. And then another week goes by, and what happens? Oh, just kidding. We had another round of elections, and it turned out that the establishment decided to join forces with the far, far left, and now they're in power. Thanks for spending a week reminding us how legitimate our elections are. What does that sound like? Exactly what I've been describing for months and months as the model for what we might see here in America if we actually do have an election. It is what the narratives point toward. Give us Donald Trump. Tell us that Larry Hogan, a person with an R next to his name, won a Senate seat in deep blue Maryland, so we all say, yeah, those elections, they have to be legitimate. A Republican won in Maryland and Donald Trump became president, while they go ahead and rig everything down ballot, everything in state and local races, all of the ballot measures, enshrining abortion in given states. And what will happen then? Either we can wait and hope that the rug will not be pulled out from under our feet, or we can prepare ourselves for the fact that we might be moving towards something else. And yes, it's a little scarier. It's a little more unknown, but it doesn't have to remain that way. We cannot be focused on holding on to something we never had to begin with. The illusion that was created for us about the country in which we lived is gone. It doesn't mean it's a bad place. It doesn't mean it was never a good place. It just means it's different than what we thought it was, so we shouldn't convince ourselves otherwise. Now, it's possible that all of this has been mapped out and planned out so well that we will actually get some version of a smooth transition where people who are really in tune with things understand what has happened, and people who are totally tuned out and don't understand what has happened at all over these last 4 years still have a version of a narrative that is capable of guiding them toward some stabilized place as this part of the process concludes. And maybe they stay tuned in to that central narrative and that official story because they are psychologically unable to leave it. And they won't be sovereign, and it'll be fine for them. They will just go on a different parallel path, and they'll continue making bad and thoughtless decisions like voting for Joe Biden, getting vaccinated, thinking elections are real, promoting foreign proxy wars. And that's not good. We can pray that doesn't happen. We can pray for better results and better outcomes for people. But if they're going to stay on that track and believe in that false reality layered on top of reality prime, it doesn't mean that we have to. We don't have to follow down that same track. There are ways to be more sovereign, no matter how national electoral politics are reported to have gone. If that means that people need to keep developing parallel industries and parallel economies and parallel communication systems and parallel financial systems, then that's what we do. And the two systems exist side by side. And whichever side is more attractive, whichever side works better, more people go to that side. And that is how we continue on. Maybe this is not about participating in elections to choose between one candidate or another. Maybe it's about choosing whether or not to participate in the system that exists, which is not our original constitutional system, or to reject that system and proceed in a different direction. And to some degree, we're already doing that because that system has failed, because we are already, in many ways, traveling down these parallel paths, using parallel social media platforms to communicate, thinking about parallel financial systems and investing in those and participating in those, using parallel communication systems, and then challenging peacefully and morally this corrupt system wherever it encroaches on our lives. We are being shown around the world that governments are corrupt, governments are incompetent, governments are illegitimate, and that elections, particularly in countries controlled by the regime for a long time, cannot be trusted, which means they cannot be the solution. You cannot create legitimacy from an illegitimate process. And so there has to be something else. It's not only the founders who would not find this radical, it's also Donald Trump. And I posted about this today on Truth Social and on Telegram. Trump, in December of 2022, after another round of rigged and stolen midterm elections, and after Trump announced that he would be a candidate in this fake 2024 campaign, he said in a series of posts on Truth Social, a massive fraud of this type and magnitude allows for the termination of all rules, regulations, and articles, even those found in the Constitution. Talking about the stolen elections in this country, he also posted, an unprecedented fraud requires an unprecedented cure. Are we supposed to pretend that he is talking about encouraging all Republicans to get out and participate in mail-in ballot early voting or in chasing and harvesting ballots? Of course he's not talking about that. So what then is the unprecedented cure? Well, we don't know for sure yet, but are things going to be business as usual? Let's ask the Magic 8 Ball. My sources say no. All right, Magic 8 Ball, are we going to win? It is decidedly so. I'll be back tomorrow at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under $0.25 per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree. Linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's